Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and this is the second part of a two-part video looking at the impacts of fluctuations in an exchange rate on macroeconomic indicators. In the first video, we looked at the Thai baht and the depreciation of that currency in the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and how that impacted aspects of inflation, GDP, unemployment in different sectors of their economy, and so on. In this video, we're going to look at Japan and the impact of an appreciation of their currency from the 1980s to about mid 1990s approximately. And after World War II, Japan was really focused on this concept of export promotion. It's an island. It has to import needed resources. In order to cover the cost of buying those resources, they need a relatively strong currency, the Japanese yen, to cover the cost of those imported inputs and or outputs. And in order to cover those costs, they need a strong yen, as I said, and would need to be driven by rising exports. Rising exports would lead to rising demand for the Japanese yen. A strong yen would lead to reduced costs of imports. And part of export promotion includes not only government guidance in protecting and building up their export-oriented industries, but also restricting imports into the country to maintain a trade surplus. So in this chart, we can see in terms of Japan's balance of trade, we're looking at imports versus exports from 1980 up until mid 1980, and then declines slightly, and then it rises again in the 1990s. But if we look at that period from 1980 to about 1986 or so, Japan is building a trade surplus against the United States, and the U.S. would have a trade deficit with Japan, whereas Japan would have a trade surplus with the U.S. So U.S. consumer demand for Japanese exports was rising. Exports being greater than imports leads to that trade surplus for Japan. And as Americans demand Japanese exports, they have to thus demand the Japanese yen in order to buy those exports. So that should correlate in this graph when we're looking at the value of one Japanese yen to US dollars. Here in this chart, we see that from about early 1980s going up to about 1988, the Japanese yen is appreciating to the US dollar. It's rising from one Japanese yen buying 0.004 US dollars to one Japanese yen buying 0.007008 US dollars. So the Japanese yen was gaining strength against the dollar, so it's appreciating. So what is the impact of that? So first, in graph A, and again, we're looking at the consequences of changes in exchange rate on economic indicators. This is a nice link between the global economy unit of the IB economics syllabus and the macroeconomy unit. We're going to be focusing, as I said, on the appreciation of a currency. So in graph A, it's the market for Japanese yen. We have the upward sloping supply of Japanese yen, S1, the downward sloping demand for Japanese yen, D1. The intersection of S1 and D1 provides at point A an equilibrium exchange rate at E1 and equilibrium quantity supply and demand at Q1. On the y-axis, we're measuring US dollars per one Japanese yen. And to illustrate an appreciation, we can either have the supply of yen decreasing as it's being absorbed out of the foreign exchange market, or we can also illustrate a rise in demand for Japanese yen. So let's use that one. So Americans from 1980 to 1988 are buying more and more Japanese exports, cars, electronics, and so forth. So the demand by Americans for the yen rises from D1 to D2. That establishes a new equilibrium at point B, where the Japanese yen to the dollar has appreciated, rising from E1 to E2, where the quantity supplied and demanded has increased from Q1 to Q2. Fine. So we have that's my son in the background, we have drawn a model, an exchange rate model, to illustrate the rise in demand for the Japanese yen, leading to an appreciation of the Japanese yen and an increase in the quantity, supply, and demand of the Japanese yen. So what is the impact on the Japanese macroeconomy? In graph B, we're going to look at what is the impact on imported inputs and outputs. So SRAS, we want to remember, is equal to the aggregate supply of all inputs and outputs within a macroeconomy. And those inputs and outputs is not only the domestically produced aggregate supply, but it's also the foreign produced aggregate supply that's imported into the nation. So Japan is importing some resources and perhaps some other inputs and outputs into their economy, which is composing their aggregate supply curve. If the Japanese yen becomes stronger, that means that it has greater purchasing power and greater purchasing power to buy foreign imported inputs and outputs. Thus, the aggregate supply curve should be shifting out, which we can illustrate here. SRAS increasing from SRAS 1 to SRAS 2. The Japanese yen, with its greater purchasing power, is able to acquire more imported inputs and output. All right, let me stress that more imported inputs and outputs. Thus, the short-run aggregate supply curve increases from SRS1 to SRS2. It thus establishes a new equilibrium at point D, where we see it reduces inflationary pressure on the Japanese economy. The price level falls from PL1 to PL2, which is deflation or disinflation, depending on what we're measuring in the economy, likely more disinflation. I don't think Japan was experiencing deflation, but in any case, you can state on an exam that theoretically it would be deflation, PL1 to PL2, and an increase in real GDP from Y1 to Y2. Now, for the import sector of the Japanese economy, for those firms that are dependent on buying those imported inputs and outputs, since those imported inputs and imported imports imported inputs and outputs leads to a fall in their average price, we would expect an increase in the quantity of aggregate demand along the AD curve from point C to point D, which would mean that unemployment in that sector would be falling. Due to the rise in the quantity of aggregate demand, there'd be more demand for resources like labor in the import sector of the Japanese economy, which would contribute to an increase in real GDP from Y1 to Y2. So that's an impact on economic indicators, macroeconomic indicators, as a result of a strong Japanese currency, strong Japanese yen. In addition, let's keep in mind aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, if we can make a little note, is equal to C plus I plus G plus, don't have a lot of space, exports minus imports. If the Japanese yen gets stronger and stronger over time, what's the impact going to be on this component of aggregate demand, on the exports minus import component of aggregate demand? Well, a stronger Japanese yen is great to import inputs and outputs, but it's not great for Japan to export. Japan is becoming less and less of a cheaper substitute. It's becoming a more expensive substitute in the world market. So we would expect, in terms of exports minus imports, that the strong Japanese yen is going to lead to a fall in imports. A fall in Japanese exports, and potentially a rise in imports. Japanese consumers, with their stronger Japanese yen, demanding more imported necessities and luxuries. Thus, this would lead to a negative value, which would push AD inward. So we can illustrate aggregate demand decreasing, perhaps in the long run, from 81 to 82. due to that strong currency. Falling exports in the long run, leading to also rising imports, Japanese consumers taking advantage of their stronger yen to demand more imported luxuries and necessities. 80 shifts into 82, that establishes a new equilibrium at point F. We would see again downward pressure on inflation. It pushed downward pressure on inflation. So the price level falls, which theoretically is deflation, PL3 to PL4, and a fall in GDP from Y3 to Y4. And where would that fall in GDP be occurring? In the export sector of the Japanese economy. The firms in Japan that are dependent on being able to export more and more would see that with a stronger Japanese yen, it's going to be more difficult for them to export. And that would lead to falling aggregate demand. It would lead to a fall in the quantity of aggregate supply of, let's say, exported goods. And it would also lead to, in the export sector, increased unemployment of resources like labor. Firms that are export oriented would have to fire labor. Thus, unemployment would rise in the export sector, and it would contribute to a decrease in GDP from Y3 to Y4. Okay, so that's an overview of the impact of an appreciation as we illustrated it in our exchange rate model, and how that impacts in the import sector in graph B, downward pressure on the price level, increase in real GDP from Y1 to Y2 in that import sector, increase in the quantity of aggregate demand leading to employing more resources like labor, unemployment falling in the import sector of Japan. Whereas in graph C, if we look at the export sector of their economy, a stronger yen makes it more difficult for those firms to export, and it can also lead to a rise in imports by Japanese consumers for necessities and luxuries, 80 shifting in, a decrease in the quantity of aggregate supply from the export sector, leading to rising unemployment and other resources, and putting downward pressure on GDP. GDP falling as a result from Y3 to Y4, and also downward pressure on inflation, or creating some deflation from PL3 to PL4. If you have any questions, don't feel free to comment those questions below, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.